Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Zuckerman. For those of you who don't know me, I am the author of the Book of Jeremiah. And welcome to the June Literary Modiin author event. Over 8 months ago, our lives were forever changed, and now we're on day 247. We did have that amazing news yesterday, welcoming home Andre, Noah, Logan, Shlomi, but we are still waiting and praying for all of our hostages to return home. And I'll say a few more words about that at the end of the session, but now I want to turn to something joyful, and that is the release of new Jewish books into the world. Literary Modiin began 5 years ago. This is our 5-year anniversary and our 50th event. So I had actually put in the reminder email that if you want to bring a drink and give a little toast with me, now is the time. So I'm going to say l'chaim, and thank you very much to all of the authors who have been who've appeared at Literary Modiin, and thank you to all of you, the attendees who have come and keep coming and have made this a thing, which I didn't expect. It's been really great and helped me enrich my life tremendously over the last 5 years. So thank you, l'chaim, and may we continue to see many, many more books come into the world that celebrate Judaism, Jews, Israelis. Occasionally, we do have in-person events. We had one last month. It was a hybrid event. I'm not sure when we're going to have the next in-person event. But anyway, thank you, all of you, for that. I am committed to keeping Literary Modiin free for everyone, but I do incur a few costs. So if you'd like to support the series in some small, tangible way, you can click on the Buy Me a Coffee link that I'll put in the chat and in the email tomorrow. For those of you who are new, the format of today's event is that each author speaks for about 15 minutes or so, and then we open it up to questions. And we have a large attendance today, so everyone's on mute, I hope. And if you somehow got off of mute, please remute yourself. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can send a private note in the chat to me. Okay, let me introduce our first author. Dawn Promislow was born and raised in South Africa and has lived in Toronto since 1987. She's the author of the novel Wan, which was a finalist for the Canadian Authors Association's Fred Kerner Book Award of 2023, and a Miramichi Best Fiction title of 2022, a Canlit Book Club pick in Zoomer magazine, and a finalist in the design category for an Alberta Book Publishing Award in 2023. The novel was on several of CBC Books recommended lists of historical fiction for 2022. Dawn is also the author of the short story collection Jewels and Other Stories, which was named one of the 8 best fiction debuts of 2011 by the Globe and Mail, and was longlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award in 2011. She is working on a new novel, so let me spotlight Dawn and mute myself. Okay, Dawn, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, first of all. Good evening, everybody. Julie, Literary Modiin, my 2 other fellow authors, guests, and all the guests. Thank you so much for having me here. Truly, it's a big honor to be in this series. Happy anniversary to the series, as Julie told us. So thank you. So I'm going to talk this evening about my novel Wan, just here. Overall, but particularly, I'm going to talk about its Jewish aspects, appropriately enough. On the surface, the novel does not actually have very pronounced Jewish aspects, or even to be that concerned about Jewish things at all. And it's exactly this elusiveness on the subject that I'm going to address in this talk right now. So perhaps to begin, I'll start talking about the writer who was perhaps my first or greatest inspiration as a writer, and that is Nadine Gordimer. She, like me, was a white Jewish South African. When I started reading Nadine Gordimer as a teenager, I recognized very quickly at once, and with a shock, really, and with immense gratitude, my world in her work. I recognized in her novels and short stories the divided society that I lived in South Africa, which wasn't talked about much in real life. Actually, we weren't really allowed to talk about it at all. At school, for instance, it was an authoritarian society, as you know. So to read in a novel and see described with such truth as well, this world was to me a revelation, a relief, and a refuge. All of that and more even. She wrote, Nadine Gorder, about the racial divide in South Africa, its moral concerns. That was her subject. That really was the subject of all her work. What puzzled me, though, as I read further, and eventually more and more, and eventually all of her work, what puzzled me was, as far as I could see, she never, ever wrote about being Jewish. And I knew she was Jewish. Once, finally, in one of her later short story collections, the collection Jump, which was published in 1991, that is to say, rather late in her career, I came across, in amazement, the story called My Father Leaves Home, which is about a Jewish person, a Jewish man or boy in Eastern Europe, sometime in the 1920s, before he emigrated to South Africa. But by the way, this is a truly wonderful story, which I recommend you read. It's just one of my favorite short stories. But in the story, Nadine Gorder had finally, to me, addressed being Jewish in the context of South Africa. But this was one small short story, a few pages long, and on the whole, her oeuvre contains few references to being Jewish. There are exceptions. They're oblique, and we're not going to talk about them here. But in comparison, for instance, with her peers in North America, Gorder's peers, that is, Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Bernard Melamed, Mordecai Richler, whose work, all of their work, is not only infused, but perhaps defined by their Jewish sensibility and concerns. She was quite different. Why? It's always puzzled me. I'm going to return to this question in a bit and perhaps propose an answer or a possible answer. But I'm going to swing directly back to me, from the sublime to the lesser of writers, of course. I know that's me. And my novel, One. I conceived of this novel first and its protagonist in 2009, which is 15 years ago. My first book, my short story collection, has stories in it that cover a wide terrain of characters and points of view, all of them in apartheid South Africa. I'd attempted in that book writing the points of view of Black South Africans, something I wouldn't do that easily today. It's become far more problematic to do that today, which is another whole subject. But point of view is what interested me and has always actually interested me the most, especially in a conflicted and divided society. It's the differing points of view of different people and groups of people which interested me the most, not only in a divided society, of course, just in general, but I came from a very divided society. That was my world. One of the stories in that short story collection has as its protagonist a white upper middle class woman. She's an artist, a painter. That story is called One. And that story was the genesis or the germ of the novel One that is our subject today. So both the short story and the novel have the same title. I wanted to explore how this character, her name is Jacqueline, who is a beneficiary as a white person of apartheid, got along. How did she live in South Africa? How did she feel? How did she experience her world? What moral dilemmas did she face? What choices did she make in this unjust society of which she was, I say again, a direct and obvious beneficiary? That was really what I wanted to explore. I consider the most important choice I made artistically in writing the book, the novel, to be the choice to write the whole thing as a first-person narrative. All 230 pages, 55,000 words of the book are written in the voice of Jacqueline, who tells her story, tells her own story, the story of her life as a white South African, complicit by default in apartheid. The whole arc of her life is really the subject of the book, or the journey of the book, the narrative journey of the book. She is 78 years old, the character, when she's telling us the story, from New York, where she and her family emigrated in 1973. So the story is therefore framed by the setting of New York City, but it takes place mostly in South Africa of the early 1970s. So why was first-person narration so important to me in this choice? Because I wanted to explore the very inside of a person, this person's psyche. I wanted to hear from her in her own voice, her own subjectivity. It's the subjectivity that I was interested in her own words. It almost felt like an impersonation, almost something like an actor does, to get into her head and into her personality, see how she felt, understand why she did or didn't do what she did. I find first-person narration a very deep and compelling way of doing this, and that's what I did. When I first imagined Jacqueline, she was not actually Jewish. She was simply a white South African. That was the key aspect of her identity that I wanted to explore. She was white. And in South Africa at that time, that was the key aspect of one's identity, literally the color of one's skin, black or white, which determined everything. Where one lived, what jobs one could hold, how one was educated, who one could love or marry, and more, as you know. But when I started writing the novel, I realized that in order to describe and know deeply enough this character and to sustain and compel the reader to listen to her for 230 pages, I needed to know more about her than I originally thought I did. For example, was she an Afrikaner? That is to say, a white South African of Dutch descent, a Christian whose first language was Afrikaans, not English? Or was she of British descent, a white English-speaking South African, Anglican Christian? Or finally, was she a white Jewish South African like me? Believe it or not, I spent a lot of time thinking about this decision. As a novelist, I believe I can and should imagine myself into almost anyone else's mind or psyche and portray it in writing, in fiction. But I realized, of course, it would be much harder to portray in such depth a character that was so far from me in who she was. It sounds obvious, but quite a lot of research would have had to be needed to truly enter into the mind of, for instance, an Afrikaner in the Dutch Reformed Church, as an example. So it came to me slowly, but it came. Jacqueline would be Jewish. In my bones, of course, I know how it feels to be Jewish, and my job, therefore, in a simple sense, would be easier. So Jacqueline is a white Jewish South African. And in the end, of course, in these large markers, she is much like myself. That is to say, a secular Jew, that's an important part, and an assimilated one. Her family, who came from Lithuania, had successfully assimilated into white South African society. I'm talking about the character Jacqueline, and felt no need for their Judaism or many of its customs. That's who Jacqueline's family is. It turns out that in this way, a process of erasure has occurred within Jacqueline and in her husband, for that matter. And perhaps it's useful to think of or see assimilation as a kind of erasure in this way. Certainly, it's a turning away from in some way, perhaps even a rejection in some degree. And erasure is a large, if not the major theme of One. But in One, in the book, in the novel as a whole, the theme is actually the erasure of the Black people of South Africa and their heritage in the colonized country that, you know, South Africa was. This really, you know, the injustice of that erasure is something that, first of all, Jacqueline is painfully aware of, and it's essentially the subject of the novel, you know, that the large injustice of the erasure of the indigenous people of South Africa. Jacqueline, the character, only realizes much later that some kind of erasure has been part of her own identity as well. Her identity, that is, as a Jewish person. And here we're going to circle back and return to Nadine Gordimer, which I said I'd do, who I finally understood was herself a secular assimilated Jew, and who in some senses erased or subsumed, certainly, her Jewish identity, which is why that identity barely appears in all her oeuvre, Jacqueline, that is. There is a somewhat redemptive arc in my novel on this issue. Jacqueline finally reclaims or claims, in some degree, her Jewish identity. Her most famous painting, she's an artist, as I mentioned, of some renown. Her most famous painting is acquired by the Jewish Museum in New York. That is the real Jewish Museum at 5th Avenue and 92nd Street. And Jacqueline understands this finally as a kind of capitulation, you could say, to who she is. A capitulation more, perhaps, than a reclamation. And finally, I must mention that since October 7th, I myself, not my character Jacqueline, who is forever embedded and frozen in amber, and fortunately for her didn't live to see October 7th, I personally have had a very confused and complicated reckoning with my own secular assimilated Jewishness, a reckoning that I expect will be going on for some time to come. I'm going to read a tiny short extract of about a minute long, if I still have time, Julie. Literally, it's a very short extract from the book, and we'll see what it is. It's my painting lives in its permanent home. It lives across the park. In the years after it was acquired, I would visit it from time to time. They were visits of pride and joy. With Howard, I would walk. I've said how much I walked, how I learned to enjoy walking here. It might have been on a spring day, the buds coming out, Howard and I still bundled in jackets for the chill, but loosening and opening our jackets as we walked. We'd walk around the reservoir, spread under the sky, the familiar winding walk, the iron rails, the runners, the dog walkers, the children in prams. I'd have Howard's arm in mine. We'd reach the traffic light at 5th Avenue, then cross and walk up to 92nd Street and turn in then to the stone building. Such an ornate building, such a distance from my stone room, my studio at the end of my garden in Johannesburg. I never failed to think of it, of the distance we had traveled from there. And Howard and I would remark again on the irony, Howard sometimes mocking me. The Jewish Museum. How is it that I, a Jew who tried not to be a Jew, have my painting there? But what makes up the identities of art in that museum? What identity do you have to claim? Yes, I am Jewish. Did I have to be Jewish? I am Jewish, born of a Jewish mother. I have finally to accept that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dawn. That was great. That was great. I took lots of notes and we'll have some questions later, but now I'm going to move on to our next author. Joan Leegant's story collection, Displaced Persons, winner of the New American Fiction Prize, came out just last week on June 1st. Mazel tov. She is also the author of a novel, Wherever You Go, and a prior story collection, An Hour in Paradise, which won the PEN New England Book Award, the Wallant Award for Jewish Fiction, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. From 2007 to 2013, she was a visiting writer at the Shandy Rudolph Creative Writing Program at Bar-Ilan University. So you have a lot. She has a lot of fans in Israel, and we missed you last week at the conference. Joan lives in Newton, Massachusetts, and now I will let you take it away, Joan. Oh, asked to unmute. Let me spotlight you. Go ahead.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Julie, for inviting me and for the lovely introduction. And so I only can see a few people, but I hope to be in touch with others. So this is my book, Displaced Persons, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about putting together a story collection like this, and also a little bit about how these stories get written. So the title, people ask about a title, Displaced Persons. Most of the stories in this book were actually published earlier in literary magazines and journals. And so when you put together a book of collection of stories, they not only give the stories a second life, you have a chance to actually create an entirely new piece of work. So the title becomes important. I chose a title, not uncommonly, from one of the stories. One of the stories is called Displaced Persons. But once I did that, it also helped me create a shape for the book, because you need to create some kind of narrative cohesion that gives an explanation or some justification for why these same stories are between the same two covers. You know, there has to be some thematic tie-in or some connection in some way or another. So I ended up that the stories, about half of them are set in Israel, half in the States. The Israel stories are labeled East, and they involve displaced persons who are usually physically displaced. They're living not in the country they were born in. The American stories have what I like to call an internal displacement. Some of them live, it sounds odd, but almost there were stories of mental illness. People were like living in the country of mental illness, or living displaced in their own homes through sort of family strife and not feeling at home or belonging among their families. So displacement and exile and belonging and home, that all seem to be one large umbrella under which these stories might flow together for a reader. So as I say, these were individual stories. They were written over a pretty long period of time. The first one to have been published was actually published in 2010, and the last one to have been published was last year. So that's over about a 13-year period. And people often wonder, you know, what takes so long? You know, I mean, I was doing other things, living a life, having jobs, working on some other projects, but stories do take a long time. When Julie mentioned that my first book was also a collection of stories, and I remember being at a public library, and there was a boy, a 15-year-old boy, raised his hand, and he asked me, you know, how long did it take to write the stories in that book? I said, well, it was about a 5 or 6 year period. And he said, you must be a really slow typist. I remember thinking, you know, well, actually I'm a fast typist, but, you know, the assumption was, look, what takes so long? You have an idea, you get a plan, you got your people, you got your setting, you got your story, and you just execute it. You know, you transcribe it, write it up. But it doesn't really work that way for me. It doesn't work that way, I would imagine, for most writers. And the way I would explain it best, I think, is when I teach, I often start by saying to people, I teach a lot now, I'll say, look, I have two heads. And take a look at me. I obviously have only one head, but I was a lawyer before I wrote fiction. I started writing fiction when I was 40. And the lawyer head is very organized and cognitive and logical and in control of the material. That's what you have to do to write briefs and be a lawyer. The other head that writes fiction is a very different head. These two heads don't particularly get along. And I cannot get to the material of fiction by thinking, the same way I get to the legal stuff by thinking. I can't do it that way. I have to get there by other means. They tend to be associative means, sort of, that rely on association. And I think the writer who articulates that, one of the writers who articulates that so wonderfully is George Saunders, if you've ever seen not only his fiction, but the way he talks about it. And he says, you have to get out of your own way. You have to leave your intentions at the door, he kind of says too. You can't orchestrate, you can't engineer your work quite that way. So this question is, how does this associative process work? I thought I would tell you 4 ways and read you little very short excerpts for 4 stories to illuminate that. So the first way that a lot of my stories get started is literally with a first sentence. And where that first sentence comes from, I don't know. But I put down the first sentence, no idea what it's going to be about, what I'm going to write about, who the people are. And then I see, is there anything in that sentence that kind of pulls me into another sentence? You know, is there anything rich? What's the material? Or maybe I hear the next sentence coming after it. So I'm going to read you just the first sentence of one of the stories and then tell you what a gift that was, luckily from that part of my brain. And the story is called Beautiful Souls. And this is the first sentence. They were two American girls, Abby and Jennifer, best friends, 16, and not entirely naive, wandering in the Arab Shuk in Jerusalem's old city. When I put that sentence down, I thought, wow, what a gift, you know, because there's a lot of first sentences that are kind of DOA. This one was packed. I thought, great, look at all the material I could work with. Two 16-year-old girls, best friends, wandering in the Arab Shuk, which is filled with all kinds of possibilities. And the other part is that they came with their names, Abby and Jennifer. And Abby and Jennifer suggested to me something about who they might be, where they might come from. Within a couple of paragraphs, I discovered they came from not far from my backyard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, which then suggested to me a certain household they may have grown up in. But the biggest gift in that first sentence was that they said they were not entirely naive. And I thought that would mean, okay, these two 16-year-old girls are saying, come on, you know, we're going out on our own. We're walking. We've been around. We know how to be in a foreign country. We're not entirely naive. I thought that's what it'd be about. But the story took me somewhere else. And the story went deeper and bigger. And the story ended up being about American naivete, about Israel, which I did not know I would write about. I didn't even know I had a lot of thoughts and feelings about. But it's like some of the writers whose interviews I've read, Joan Leegant said this, and James Baldwin, many others, that they don't know what they think until they write it down. And that is pretty much the way it works for me. I don't know what I'm going to say or think. So I rely on some means, the sentences in that case, to take me to what I think or know. A second way that sometimes my stories get written, and it happened here, is through a title. And a title operates like a prompt. A title has a way of sort of calling up the material that's in that other hidden part of my brain, comes up and says, a title pulls it out for me. So during the time that I was in Israel at Bar Ilan, I would read the Haaretz in English, other English language papers about Israel. And I read once that Israel was named the 11th happiest country in one of those surveys. You know, these are self-reporting. Invariably, the first ones are like Scandinavian countries, which is odd because they also have a high suicide rate, but that's another story altogether. In any case, Israel that year was like the 11th happiest country. And I remember reading that and thinking, well, that's kind of funny. Like, it's not the top 2 or the top 5, it's not the bottom 30th. I thought 11th happiest country, there must be something I could do with that as a story. And the other piece of it was at the same time, 2 other things were happening in the back of my head. I had started to put this collection together. Did that confetti just come down on the screen? Yeah.
Because you said the word happiest. I don't know.
Okay. Well,
By the way, we're the ranked fifth happiest country now, even with the
oh, I know. I read this year is much higher. I know it has moved up in the rankings.
Yeah.
But that year, for some reason, the 11th, I don't know, maybe it was the economy. In any case, I remember at the time, there were 2 other things going on in my mind. I had started to put this collection together to see what I had. I had a lot of Israel stories, but they almost all involved Americans as well. And I thought, I need to write a story that just has Israelis in it. So this was also a little bit of my motive. And another association that probably came from that was that I was steeping myself voluntarily in the stories of Edgar Keret, whose work I love. I love his short stories. They're economical, they pack a punch, they are deceptive, and they look like they're simple or just funny, but they really are, in my mind, profoundly moving. And I love his voice. It's right in your face. It starts right up in the middle of things. So I was kind of channeling Edgar Keret and my desire to write about Israelis, and I began this story. I'll read you the opening of this. It's called The 11th Happiest Country. Roy's old friend from the army, Tal, had been an actor before he got religious, and now he wanted to make another film and wanted Roy to do it, an action flick. Tal checked with his Rebbe in Bnei Brak, and it was all right. Whoa, man, looking like that, said Roy, waving at Tal's face, the beard, the payas spiraling down over his ears, the black kippah. They were at a cafe in downtown Tel Aviv on Shenkin. It wasn't certified kosher, but you couldn't trafe up espresso beans. So that's the opening to that story. And it came about, like I say, from a title. A third way, talk about a gift, was another way. I don't expect this is going to happen too often, but I was once commissioned to write a story. I don't know of any writers who have that. You know, composers get commissioned and painters get commissioned. But I got an email one day a bunch of years ago from NPR, National Public Radio in America. For 34 years, they've been doing something called Hanukkah Lights, where they read on a special show around Hanukkah short stories. And they contacted me. I already had one, maybe 2 books out by then. Would I write a story for them? And not only that, they would pay me, and they were going to pay me a very nice amount of money, which you don't usually get for short stories. So, of course, I was going to try to do that. So I wrote several stories, and one of them is in this book. It's not the one that ended up on NPR because I ended up with a shorter one that I thought would work better on the radio. But this one is in this book, and it had its origins. And the only criteria that NPR required, you could write about anything, but it had to have Hanukkah in there somewhere. And you're going to hear Hanukkah right up front. So it's called Roots, and this is the opening. Hirschman, unwilling to bend, was refusing to participate. A lifelong agnostic and proud of it, he'd managed for 82 years to not observe a single of his people's canonical festivals except in its breach, and he had no intention of starting now. It was his father's way before him, and his father's father's, and now it was his. He ate bread on Passover, went to the track on Yom Kippur, and since childhood had miraculously avoided the trappings of this one, the relentlessly marketed Jewish Christmas, when boys and girls with names like Cohen and Levy were commanded to ignore the country's love affair with eggnog and fruitcake in favor of oily potato dishes invented by starving peasants in Galicia. So when I wrote that, another great thing about that was Hirschman arrived fully formed. This guy was an ornery character. I knew a lot about him. He was a great kind of figure to give a lot of flavor and texture. And he also was 82. When I wrote this, Hirschman now would be about 95. And he reminded me, as Dawn said earlier, of the characters that might have been written by Grace Paley or Philip Roth, or early Philip Roth or early Bernard Malamud, a kind of Jewish type that I felt I could explore in mine. And that's what that story gave me. And the last one I'll tell you about was almost the hardest of all. In a way, the story was easy to write, but I wrote about something I never wanted to write about. I never thought I would write about. Most autobiographical story I've ever written, and I didn't want to do it. But how did it happen? So when I teach, I often teach like a master class, a half day or a whole day of people coming together, and we would read and take apart material and do exercises and so forth. And then sometimes during those sessions, there'll be maybe a 15-minute writing session where you have to write. And I always say to the participants, be fearless, be bold, don't be afraid of what comes up, stay in the chair, stay at it. This is a supportive environment. And I also always make it a practice during these sessions to also write, because I want the participants to see we all are facing the blank page. I may be further along in either the craft or the publishing process, but I'm facing a blank page just like everybody else. So I had to stay in the room too. And that particular day, I remember I was in Israel and I was teaching at a private writing studio. And I thought, well, I didn't want to write. I wasn't in the mood. I was tired, but I said, well, I'll do something. And I decided I would write about this particular bus. I used to take a bus from my apartment to Bar Ilan. It was a very unusual kind of bus. So I thought, all right, I'll write about the bus. However, the story had really different ideas, had other ideas. And I'm going to read to you from Bus, the opening. It's a little bit longer excerpt than the others, but I think you'll bear with me. It's called Bus. I waited for the bus at the stop I was told to use by the people I was supposed to meet at the university. We were going to talk about a paper I'd written decades before when I lived in California. The department had heard I was visiting Israel and wanted to meet. I wasn't interested in the paper anymore, but didn't want to be rude, plus I had time on my hands. But when I got to the stop, I was afraid it wasn't the right line, afraid I'd misunderstood their accented English, or written the number down incorrectly, or had the wrong street. This happened often. I worried about getting lost or arriving late or ending up in a strange city and not being able to find my way back to wherever I'd come from. So that morning, I decided I would work up my courage and ask the driver, no matter how brusque he seemed, if this was the right line. I practiced words while I waited in the shelter, trying not to attract the attention of the other women standing there with their plastic bags of groceries. But when I climbed up the metal stairs and heard the whoosh of the doors closing and felt the bus lurching down the tree-lined boulevard, I forgot all about asking the driver. All around me were stuffed animals, plush brown teddy bears and monkeys with curly tails and baby kangaroos in their mothers' pouches, turtles and lions and soft yellow ducks. They were strapped to the poles and tied to the overhead hangers and swinging from the ceiling on fishing line. A pink and blue snake was threaded through the grab bars between the first 3 rows of seats, linking them together like a pillowy chain, and I stopped worrying about my appointment and the university and the bus line and thought about the last time my son got an infusion. So there it was. I have a son who had cancer, and I never thought I would write about his cancer, or more importantly for the story, about accompanying him through his treatment and sitting there day after day during his chemo, or week after week, I should say. But I had no choice. It was almost as if that narrative brain said to me, because I was in this confined space, I was in a physical space, and also it was only 15 minutes. It was as if that part of my brain said, gotcha, you have to stay here. You can't be a hypocrite. You told everybody else, be fearless, so stay there. And I wrote the story, and it's the shortest thing I've ever written. It was a fiction. It was 900 words. I think I wrote it in that 15, 20-minute span entirely. So the nice part of that story is that really was an actual bus. It runs along Rothschild from my apartment to Bar Ilan. There was a grandfatherly guy who decorated his bus that way. And I would get that bus maybe every second or third time I went to the university. I came back a year later to teach at Bar Ilan again, and by then the story had been published and had even won a prize, and I saw the man at the bus. I said, I wrote a story about your bus. He said, I'd like to read it. Thank you. My English isn't so good, but my daughter will translate it for me. So I shared the story with him. So I hope that gives you a little window into some of how these stories get written. It sounds more neat and tidy than it really is. For every 14 stories that make its way into a book like this, there are probably 40 that never come together or pull together. And writing this way without intention and planning can be nerve-wracking. But on the other hand, these experiences offer up discovery and surprise. And, that's part of the joy for me of writing. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joan. Wow, I also took lots of notes, lots of things to say. And by the way, last week at the conference, Joshua Cohen, the author of the Netanyahus, was there, and he was also talking about he writes in order to know what he thinks, which is what I feel also. I also said that in my interview. Okay, let me introduce our final author of the evening. Writer, podcaster, and storyteller Dawn Futterman has written for a variety of publications, including The Daily Beast, Haaretz, and Times of Israel. For the past 13 years, Dawn has been a co-host of TLV1's The Promised podcast, a weekly review of Israeli politics and society with more than 3 million downloads. Dawn can also be heard on Futterman's one-man show, a performance podcast of moving and funny autobiographical monologues. Dawn has published 2 children's books in Hebrew, Yaniv's Treasure and Up and Over, and he is the founding director of the Israel Center for Educational Innovation, which transforms underperforming Jewish and Arab elementary schools serving low-income communities in Israel. He is the Israel director of the Moriah Fund, a private American foundation working to advance civil rights and to promote equality and strengthen liberal democracy in the U.S. and Israel. Married with 3 children, Dawn grew up in a public school boy in Flushing, Queens, and currently lives in Kfar Saba, Israel. So let me spotlight you, Dawn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Dawn and Joan. It was wonderful. I'm going to tell you a little about my novel, Adam Unrehearsed. It's a coming-of-age comedy. It's set in New York in 1970, 1971, which is just when American Jewry was really coming of age, and I'll come back to that a little later. So I call it a comedy because adolescence is a hysterically funny time of life, not when you're going through it, but definitely when you look back. It's one big social misunderstanding after another, and it's filled with pain, as all good comedy is. And I see things comically. Like Richard Russo says, comic writers don't try to be funny. They just see the world comically, which I think is very true for me. So, of course, the heart of your social experience at that time is your friends. And at its heart, this book is really about friendship. So without giving too much away, the novel's 12-year-old protagonist, Adam Miller, exchanges some old friends for some new friends in the course of the novel, people he would not have expected to even know, let alone become attached to. I also wanted to describe in this book a boy falling in love with performing. And he's actually on two different stages. On the theater stage in his acting class, where for the first time he really gets to be the center of attention of large groups of people. But he also is performing on the bima of his shul, of his conservative synagogue. He's in his preparation year for his bar mitzvah. And even though he doesn't have a great voice, so long as he stays within the narrow singing range, essentially the Haftorah range, if you know what that amounts to, he will stay on key. Now, Adam has a lot of mentors you meet in the novel, his older brother, who he idolizes, but he's also starting to rebel against, his parents, his cantor, his drama teacher, and he's trying to figure out what each of them wants from him. And, you know, he's also trying to please them, but he's also trying to be perfect. And he's trying to please himself, which is a really tough balancing act. Adam comes from a middle-class family. Just before the novel starts, they've seemingly moved up in the world, going from a modest apartment to a private house. But Adam is clinging to his old life, and he finagles a way to go to the junior high school that his elementary school pals are going to, even though it's far from his new neighborhood, and it's not what he's zoned for. If you live in New York, you're zoned for specific schools. And junior high school for him becomes kind of the big wide world. Up until now, he's been somewhat sheltered. He's been the star of his elementary school and the star of his Hebrew school, but in junior high school, he's a small fish in a much bigger pond. Now, thanks to the mobility granted him by his bicycle and his parents' permission that he can go on the subway by himself, he's encountering a much more daunting world, and that world turns out to be dangerous. Pretty damn scary in ways he's utterly unprepared for. He faces real violence for the first time. Later in the novel, he faces death in a way he wouldn't have imagined either. And he encounters anti-Semitism, not virulent anti-Semitism, but genuine anti-Semitism, and he doesn't know what to make of it. His father is a devoted inner city school principal and teacher, and he tells him to keep things in proportion. But his older brother is in a militant Zionist youth movement, Beitar, and he thinks Armageddon is approaching and the Jews better train for self-defense, and he practices on Adam. And his brother is particularly pissed off that African Americans seem to have turned against the Jews, something which Adam questions because it doesn't seem to jive with his experience. Which leads us to the question of Adam's Jewish identity. Like me, Adam belongs to the first generation of American Jews that really had no doubts about belonging. I mean, I grew up with a multi-ethnic group of friends from my neighborhood, from my public school, overlapping with a subset of Jewish friends, including some I only knew from Hebrew school. But there was no question about feeling American. We were all American. We were all very proud. We all felt like we belonged. We didn't see any conflict between being Jewish and being American. And, you know, we also, my Jewish and non-Jewish friends, all had another identity. Some of us went to school after school to reinforce that second identity. So for me, it was Hebrew school. For my Catholic friend, mostly Italian, but not all, they went to Catholic school or catechism classes. My Japanese friend went to Japanese classes. You know, for Hebrew school, for me, it kind of took over much of my week, several afternoons, Saturday morning for junior congregation, Sunday morning for Sunday school. You know, so it was pretty intense complement to going to regular school. But we had no idea what the other kids were doing. We didn't know what they were learning in their schools. They didn't know what we were learning in our schools. Our common life was taking place in the neighborhood and in elementary school. So it was kind of like Superman, another Jewish immigrant who had a secret identity of Clark Kent. We all had our secret identities and our secret superpowers. The bar mitzvah, which the book is leading up to, it's his bar mitzvah year, is kind of frames the whole novel, was the one day that all of the Jewish and non-Jewish friends would see a Jewish boy in that uniquely Jewish context, in that other identity. And it was that secret identity was on public display and in costume, not only because we had to wear ties and jackets to our bar mitzvah, but also we had to wear a kippah and a talit. And all of our non-Jewish friends had kippot, and some of them had talitot plopped on them too by the sergeant at arms when they came into the shul. So I wanted to write this book because I wanted to tell a story about a Jewish boy who is not Orthodox, but for whom bar mitzvah and shul, the synagogue, are portrayed positively. I mean, I grew up on American Jewish fiction where American Jewish institutions were always ridiculed, sometimes brilliantly ridiculed. They're very funny books, and as an expression of materialistic culture, or to expose, or sometimes I would say actually to exemplify a shallow and tenuous connection to Judaism and Jewish life. The writers mocking them didn't actually know very much about them in most cases. But I wanted to show a boy for whom this actually mattered in his life. And he was building the blocks that would create his Jewish identity. Pride in Israel, the Six-Day War gave us so much newfound pride and confidence that we went public with Israel parades, and even our own political cause, the Soviet Jewry movement, which for American Jews is very daring to go out and create our own cause. And the Yom Kippur War was still a few years away, so we were all pretty much flying about these things. And in the course of the novel, you see Adam start to build his own Jewish identity, mimicking his older brother, taking his first tentative steps towards activism, but also finding a place in his preparation for the bar mitzvah that made a great deal of a significance for him. And he becomes very closely bonded to his cantor, who's training him. Now, I set the book in 1970, 71, not just because I was a personal eyewitness to those years, so I have a lot to recall, but because that was the time when we were still kind of feeling the reverberations of the New York City teacher strike in 1968, which pitted a largely Jewish-dominated teachers union against some Black community activists who wanted community control. And I wanted that issue, since that's kind of found new reverberations in the last 5 or 10 years, I wanted that issue front and center to see where it all started, where those fissures began, and telling it from the point of view of a kid who's trying to piece it together, who's trying to understand the politics, even though he doesn't understand what the politics are. And since I think the American Jewish experience is just a phenomenal success story, I wanted to capture that mood of 50 years ago. I'm going to read you a longer section than our other writers, so I hope you'll bear with me. This is what the book looks like. You can see it behind me as well, but I'm going to actually read it from the screen so I can look more directly at you. Okay. This is Adam and Jason, his best friend. They were 15 minutes late for Hebrew school. To evade their prowling principal, they used their secret entrance, a ground floor window that did not lock properly from the inside and led to the junior congregation's sanctuary stage. A passageway connected this old synagogue to the Hebrew school building next door. But today, they didn't have to jimmy the window open because it had been smashed. A baseball from kids playing in the parking lot, Adam thought at first. But the windows on either side had also been broken. The boys were careful to dislodge the jagged shards, still embedded in the wooden frame as they climbed through. But Adam's foot landed on something which made him topple over, and when his hand hit the ground, it was cut by the glass lying on the floor. Damn! Adam wiped the blood on his shirt. He had tripped on a brick. The boys found 3 bricks lying on the floor, surrounded by splinters and slivers of glass. Wow, this was on purpose, Adam declared. We have to tell Mr. Biner. Biner will think we broke the windows to sneak in, Jason told him. But Adam laughed. You go ahead, Adam suggested. Adam knew Jason was irritated with anything related to the temple. I'll wait a few minutes and then I'll tell Biner I saw something suspicious. I'll meet you in class. You sure? Jason asked. He likes me. They all like you. Mr. Biner seemed to know about the secret entrance, which surprised Adam, and he didn't interrogate him about what he'd been doing at the rear of the old building. He surveyed the crime scene for several minutes, his face contorting as he debated what to do. At last, he handed Adam one of the bricks and sent him to show it to the rabbi. But don't say a word to anyone else, do you understand? Rabbi Arthur Ellenbaum was intimidating, with his stentorian scholarly way of speaking, his gaze both distant and penetrating, his thick hair with a touch of silver that glinted off his steel glasses with authority. Unlike Mr. Rockowitz, he didn't look religious except for his small knitted kippah. His private study was in the corridor of the new building, across from the glass-walled office of his gatekeepers. Adam knocked rapid fire on Rabbi Ellenbaum's oak door, hoping the rabbi wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him, that the secretaries wouldn't spot him. The door opened just as they began to rise to intercept Adam. "You're holding a brick, and you're covered in blood. Are you building a bookshelf or starting an insurrection?" Come in. Take this." He handed Adam the handkerchief from his jacket pocket. "Apply continuous pressure. And after you tell me what's what, you'll go to the restroom and wash it thoroughly in the sink." Yes, sir, I'm Adam Miller." "I know who you are, Adam. Your parents are old friends." "They are?" Adam sputtered out his report. "More bad news." Rabbi Ellenbaum let out a pained sigh. "Let me walk you back to class, but first the bathroom." After Adam rinsed his wound, they went to inspect the broken windows. The rabbi poked his head with care through the shattered glass, laid the brick down outside, then led Adam around to the front entrance. "Let me handle this, Adam. I'm going to have to ask you not to say anything about this to your friends." Jason was with me. We found it together." "Jason?" "Boyer." "Boyer, all right, thank you. Not a word to anyone else, though." "Right." The rabbi rarely entered the old Hebrew school building, so the class was rattled when he strolled in with them. The teacher leapt out of his seat so fast his kippah fell on the floor. He picked it up. He kissed the yarmulke, decided he need not have kissed it, dropped it on the floor again, picked it up again without kissing it, and clipped it to the hairs covering his bald spot. Adam expected Rabbi Ellenbaum to explain about the broken windows, to warn them to report suspicious strangers, and wondered if he was going to give Adam credit for reporting the incident. But he was wrong on all counts. The rabbi's news was that Mr. Rockowitz, the head of junior congregation, would be out sick for months and could not prepare them for their bar mitzvahs. The new cantor would take over training the bar mitzvah boys immediately. The bar mitzvah boys were ordered to accompany Rabbi Ellenbaum around the corner to the new synagogue. Adam remembered his brother Seth's bar mitzvah as the grand event of his childhood, and he was eager to equal him. Rabbi Ellenbaum quietly asked Adam to walk ahead with him, ahead of the small pack. "The bricks you found today could be nothing. Vandalism most likely. But some people don't like the fact that we've taken over Parsons Boulevard with our new synagogue. It's too early to tell if they are run-of-the-mill anti-Semites or something more ominous. Please remember, don't talk about this incident to anyone but your parents. We don't want to cause a panic. Can I count on you?" Adam gulped twice. "There are run-of-the-mill anti-Semites in Flushing?" "Yes, sir." "Very good. And pass the word to your friend Joseph." "Jason Boyer?" "Right, Boyer. Tell him to keep mum." "I will." "Good. Go back to your friends." His classmates grilled Adam for information. "Nothing," Adam insisted, "nothing important." Rabbi Ellenbaum left the entourage on their own to wait for the cantor in the banquet hall, a refurbished all-purpose room outfitted with a soundproof folding door, hidden by velvet curtains and newly installed ceiling molding in inexplicable swirling patterns designed to suggest elegance. Adam had never seen this vast, empty space naked before, lit only by fluorescence, absent banquet tables, food, frills, music, or lighting. The bar mitzvah group hugged the walls and marked time, making jokes quietly. "Boys!" a voice boomed, as a bullish figure strode to the center of the room, directly under the chandelier. "Why you are standing there? Chairs! Now!" It was him, the crazy man. And that's from chapter 3. So near the beginning.
Thank you, Don. I'm gonna add my spotlight and Joan's spotlight, Dawn's spotlight, and you can put your questions in the chat. And let me ask you all to unmute. I feel like anybody who's ever been to America, to like Queens, and a shoal there, can totally picture the shoal and the curtains and everything you're describing there. So, Kulikavod, wow. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So far, just congratulations and recommendations to read everyone's books, which I can also recommend all three of these books. They're all wonderful. Anyone have any questions, or do you guys have questions for each other? Or should I start with mine?
I have a question for Adam.
For Dawn.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you hear me?
Yeah, no, for Dawn.
Okay, so it was a question for Adam. I loved your reading. And when you're writing, do you hear the conversations in your head? Is that what it's like for you as you're putting down these vivid dialogues?
Yeah, I hear the characters and I try to find their voices, and I rewrite the dialogues a lot so I can get the characters sounding different from each other. For sure.
Yeah, I love the dialogues too. They were so alive. And I have trouble with
Thank you.
dialogue. I don't feel I can't do them. So I don't hear people that well. So I don't think that I enjoyed that too.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question. Maybe it's more for Joan and Dawn, because you both have about the writing in the first person. And Joan, at least one of your stories that you read from was in first person. But if you also write in the third person, like I almost never write in the first person, like never, unless I'm writing a personal essay. But in my fiction, I don't know, I always just go straight to that third person close narrative. So like, and I understand, Dawn, you explained already you wanted to you were interested in the subjectivity, but can you talk a little bit about the differences writing first person and third person? Dawn, feel free to also chime in if you've written first person as well.
Well, I'll say something. I'm aware of that because my first story collection had one first person story in it, and it was the only first person story I wrote for 15 years. I never wrote in the first person until these stories. And I also never wrote about women, or seldom wrote about women. Suddenly, with this book, like quite a bit older and later in my life, I found myself writing about women and these first person stories, and they just kind of came in a rush. I was never oriented toward first person like you. Fiction always sounded to me like third person, mostly past tense, sometimes present tense. And I don't know what it is, honestly. I think it was sort of like a willingness or a desire to investigate stuff that was a little closer to the bone, and it had to come out in first person. I don't actually feel like I have a great choice over it. It's just the way it sounds when it comes, but it was just a matter of time. And it wasn't the natural initial writing for me at all.
That's so interesting because I have the complete opposite instinct, and I do think it's an instinct from Julie and Joan in that, because I almost think best when I'm in the first person of a person, a character, and I don't actually have a reason. Can't actually explain it. As I say, it's some kind of instinct that I feel. I just gravitate. And my first story collection, a few of there are 14 stories in there, I think, and maybe half of them maybe our first person. I don't exactly remember, but I mean, I always like first person. So I don't know, and I still do. I sort of feel like it's easier to understand someone if you're speaking in their voice somehow. That's how I feel, but it's hard to no explanation really. Yeah.
So when I started writing, I wrote this novel actually originally in first person, and then rewrote it in kind of a close third person. And it was partly because it's a 12-year-old kid, and I felt like I was getting limited by what I could say or the perspectives I could have, because I couldn't go. I mean, I'm pushing the limits. I think he has insights that are often older than a 12-year-old, but I couldn't go too much further. And I wanted to say other things, so I redid it and moved out Also said that I would be able to write about scenes where he's not there. And there are scenes in the book where Adam's not in the scene. He wouldn't have known what had happened. So that was a real shift, and it got going trying to find this kid's voice, but then breaking out of that gave me a lot more freedom when I was revising and really rewriting the book.
That's great. Okay, Diana has a question. First of all, I guess the answer is that it's just your instinct, like whatever feels right. I don't know. So for me, third person close usually feels right. Okay, Diana, question. Did any of the authors switch from shorter to longer pieces or vice versa, or switch from poetry to stories as a way to flex the writer's muscles? And if so, has that been beneficial?
Well, I wrote these stories while I was also writing the drafts of 2 novels. I struggle more with novels because they're big and I always feel like I have to have a plot, and then I create some artificial thing that doesn't work. So, I'm always in between. My little, treat for myself is to write a short story because I really love writing short stories, but I do move between the two. And I will probably go back to one of these novels now. I actually had to put it aside October 7th. I couldn't really work on anything fictional at that point. I wrote some essays, and I'm still writing essays too. So I have shifted among the genres quite a lot. And I have, so I didn't used to think I had that flexibility or fluidity. I don't know why. Maybe I was just sort of stuck on the idea that I could only write fiction. But now as I say, I write also essays, and I'll probably go back to these longer forms. They have different demands, I find. But I'm not, in a way, having put these novels aside for a while. I actually listened to an interview with someone else recently who said having distance on it always helped her come back after a long hiatus to see the solutions to the problems that the manuscript was posing, which I always know. You put aside, put it in the drawer, you let it cool off, or another friend of mine used to say, let it marinate, these kinds of expressions. But now having a pretty long distance on one of these novels, I feel like I have a better idea of how to now solve the problems that I was aware of but didn't know what to do with. So the distance can help. Someone asked if it's helpful. The distance, I have found, especially working on a novel, can help you put it aside for a while. And sometimes the stories too, you have to put them aside and come back to them like much later, and then you can see, what they need.
Yeah, I have found, sorry, for my part, switching genres very much part of the process of writing a novel. I started writing short stories. That was my first writing that I did, and my first book was a collection of short stories, and I love short stories, although I seem to have stopped writing them now. But then I started writing poems and publishing poems, and I feel that the poetry was very much part of the development of the novel, actually. Again, it's not that easy to explain how, but I just think that a different way of thinking about things, smaller to bigger, bigger to smaller. Obviously poems are smaller and compressed and novels are bigger, but somehow a poetic way of thinking, very metaphorical, of course, and imagistic and sensory, which is very much what I think of as a poetic kind of way of thinking. Definitely I feel necessary in a novel often, or certainly in my case. So I feel like it feeds on each other, and I don't have a rigid way of, I just feel that it all, whatever, yeah.
So I do a couple of different kinds of writing because I was a columnist for Haaretz for years, and the Daily Beast. And what I found, and I also done these autobiographical monologues, which some of which I used to perform, some of which I did on a podcast. So I find when I write fiction, or I write something that's not actually restricted to real events, one thing leads to another, and I can't write short form. I can't write a short story. It just gets too convoluted, gets too complicated. Like one story starts and then a second story comes in and a third character comes in, and I have to follow all of them. So it just grows. So if I'm writing a play, if I'm writing a novel, it's usually long. And, for the other things, for an autobiographical monologue, it's based on something that happened. I just have to kind of artificially find some place to begin and end, because life doesn't actually have a beginning or ending. You just sort of frame it somehow. And in a column, the same thing. You have 850 words. You have to get your point across. You have to, start and get back to it by the end and fit in this little form, which is good. It forces you to be succinct, but it's also very restricting. So I find when I let my imagination start going, which is the most fun, but also the hardest for me, it just goes on and gets too long for short stories. So I'm impressed at people who can compress everything into a short story and get across so much.
I'm impressed with people who can write a novel. I mean, I'm attempting one now. I have one that's in the drawer, that's been in the drawer for a couple of years, but I don't know. I don't know about going back to it. Certainly, especially
It's running a marathon instead of a sprint.
Yeah. But okay, Benjamin has a question here. If any of the writers might be willing to share or interested to share when and how you discovered you were a writer, and or what or who influenced you to inhabit the role of a writer, not merely as a hobby, but as a vocation. Which I like. I'm going to adopt that word for myself, vocation. I'd love to hear too what draws you to write stories or novels over poetry that is predominantly write in prose rather than poetry. Why don't you take this one first? When did you know you were a writer?
Dawn or Dawn? Dawn.
Oh,
I did.
Dawn. Fun last.
Okay. Well, I've been writing my whole life, but it's not what I made a living off of for most of my life. So I did work as a performer, doing one-man shows for like 10 years, and then I came to Israel and got married and had to pay the bills and have like a whole other work life. But partly because this morning I came from the kind of the peak event of the program I run in the nonprofit that I run, where we had a young writers competition with about 5,000 kids submitting stories, most of them this year about the war, about October 7th, including some very painful and very personal stories. But the kids are not restricted. They can write about anything. And this morning we had our finale with 650 third through sixth graders, going crazy, waiting to see who was going to win to get these prizes. I realized when I started to do this work and I was starting to work with children's authors and children's books, I was like, okay, I have stories like that. And I started to meet publishers through my work. And so got my, that's how the connections were made that led to my first children's books, which is so ironic to you. My first book ever published is 380 words long, and it's in Hebrew. And it was. I wrote it in English, rewrote it in Hebrew. Then my kids who grew up here, fixed my Hebrew for me and made it sound like it should. But and my wife helped with that. But most people don't know me as a writer, so they're really surprised, like that I actually have books out. But in my head, I've been a writer since I was 10. Since I wrote stories in my class, or like one of my great moments in high school was writing a continuous story, which I would pass around to my classmates every day, another chapter, and they would read it under the desk until our teacher caught one of them, and he just grabbed it out of his hands and he read it. Like he just stopped in the middle of the classroom and he read the whole story while he was standing there, and he took it and he tacked it onto the bulletin board, and he said, if anybody wants to borrow Futterman's story, you can take it. Just bring it back after recess, and tomorrow you have to bring us the end of the story. He just went on. So that was, discovering the power of writing at an early age.
Dawn, what about you? When did you know you were a writer? Yes. Dawn, how about, as we say?
Not until very recently, believe it or not, and I'm quite old. I consider I've always been a reader, and I believe that writers have to be readers first. And reading was always my lifeblood since I was a child. But I never for a minute thought that I was a writer or that I could write. And I think it had a lot to do with fear and also where I grew up. You know, it was not a free place, of course. I just didn't feel, I felt very constrained in how I thought even. You know, I mentioned even when I was talking, how I didn't feel free. I wasn't free to talk about what I really believed in South Africa in 1970. You know, you couldn't actually. So I think I had a very secret life actually in my mind, where most of what I thought, serious things, I didn't express at all. And but I read a fortune, and as I say, I almost feel like I mentioned Nadine Gorham. I mean, there's reading and reading and reading. It's almost like these words in my mind. You know, I mean, that's how I feel. I became a writer. I'm certain of that. And you know, only literally 15, 20 or 20 years ago, when I was a fully grown adult, beyond fully grown, and I was in Canada, in a free country, and everything, and very far away from South Africa, that I started writing freely. And it was very strange, you know, because I didn't, so I that's how I believe it's connected with this feeling of constraint that I always had and that I no longer feel. Well, actually, I'm wrong. I always feel constraint. And I think that's part of the power, actually. When you write, you are always writing against some kind of fear of exposure, perhaps, or fear of censure, even. There is something, you know, it's almost a secret thing. You're telling something that's in your mind. So I do actually believe that's part of it. So even now, where I am, of course, in a free country, and I can write what I want and so on, I always feel that I'm writing against something, or against myself, something in myself. And I believe that has a lot of power, and I believe in it, actually. I believe that's part of it. And I'm certain every writer in some way, wherever they are, is writing against in that way. I mean, maybe against is the wrong word, but perhaps you understand what I mean.
And I think your character, Jacqueline, also is like, your book feels like the prose is very beautiful, but it's sparse. It feels also that she's constrained and she's telling her story against something, you know?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I agree.
Okay.
The character herself has that,
yeah.
because she's an artist, and
Yeah.
she, as an artist, I mean, she's not a novelist, she's an artist, a painter, but she's fighting to express herself in her paint, and she struggles, as we see. So.
Joan, when did you know you were a writer?
Well, you know, I was listening, and I envy Dawn's youthful enthusiasm and support. You know, I'm not blaming anybody. It took me till I was 40 to kind of decide. I always wrote. I wrote poetry, I wrote essays, I wrote all kinds of stuff, but it was pretty closeted. And, I don't blame anyone else. I went to law school. I went to college at a time when the women in my college were being encouraged to enter the male professions. And I just, I didn't have the guts, or I don't know what it was. Actually, I wouldn't say guts. I had other guts. I was willing to go to law school when there weren't many women going to law school, but it was kind of closeted. The personal expression was truly private. It took me a very long time to decide that I could put that front and center in my life. And even then, I didn't tell people. I was 40 and I had little kids at home, so I didn't tell people, because I live in a very prosperous suburb. And if you say, and very professional, if you say you're a writer, they say, "Oh, what have you published?" And the answer for a long time is nothing. So, it was a psychological thing, combination of circumstances, psychology. I always liked to write, but the word writer, I wasn't going to attach that to myself for quite a while. But eventually, did. So, I don't have, it was just it's a little bit of a serpentine process, but I got there.
I was also just shy of 40, like 38 or 39. And also I consider myself a writer, but not a creative writer, right? Like, I started in journalism, and only when just, the power of suggestion, someone said to me, "Oh, why don't you take a creative writing class?" And with Judy, who's here. Hi, Judy. Yes. Right. She said, "Oh, I'm taking a writing class with Judy Levinson." But I'm like a huge reader, and I love reading, and authors are my rock stars. So yeah, I'd like to try it, but I didn't think I was creative. So you never know when it's gonna hit you. There is another question here. There's two more quick questions. One is from Pessy. I guess this is for Dawn. How would your wonderful story be if it was among Israelis rather than American adolescents?
Well, it's so different. You know, I see my kids growing up because they're all born and raised here, and you know, it's sometimes it's mind-boggling because in a certain way, my kids have lived through several wars. You know, we had during the Second Intifada. They were very young. There were 6 terrorist attacks within 5 blocks of our house. You know, they've served in the army and served for many years. Some of them and in very tense situations, difficult situations. And on the other hand, you know, they feel a lot safer than I did as a 12-year-old boy in New York City. You know, they don't have the fears just, you know, getting around on their own that we were taught to have, because we had a strict routine for what you do when you're mugged, not if you're mugged, when you're mugged. You know, and that's just not part of their experience. Like, they can't imagine that. Like, they read this book and they're like, how did you live through that? You know, it's just like, so it's just like the things you just take for granted. And, you know, you talk to friends in America and they're like, how are the kids managing with all this stress? And it's just like, I don't know, they're watching, they're doing their homework and watching, they're just talk to their friends. You know, I mean, not the trauma of October 7th. That was all horrific for everybody, but the usual things that we're dealing with in this country, in most of the world, would seem completely insane, you know, to be tolerating. So I think it's a really different arc. I mean, the biggest difference is, especially for an American Jewish kid, and I don't think it's very different today from when I grew up. You know, you're very directed towards college. You know, college is what's coming. That's like where you're headed. After that, it's kind of up to you. But that's your first step, and you know that since you're 6 years old. And in Israel, that's not how it happens. You know, you go from high school to the army. You have a whole different way of leaving home. And my kids had so much more responsibility. You know, when my sons were both officers in Shmona Matayim, the intelligence units in the army, and they weren't allowed to tell me what they were doing, but I got some sense of what they were up to. And they had so much responsibility, you know, in some cases for people's lives very directly. And they were, 20, 21. You know, when I was 21, my biggest challenge is waking up to get to my 9 o'clock classes. And I failed that challenge 90% of the time. You know, so it's just such a different, it's a different way of growing up, you know, and then you get to university after that and you're an adult already. So you relate to it completely differently.
And in your book, by the way, right, the central, one of the central things is the shul in his life, right? Preparing for
Right.
bar mitzvah, junior congregation, and Hebrew school, and all of that, and even those of us who go to shul regularly here in Israel, and up to a certain point, our kids came at least through their bar mitzvahs. It's not the central, thing going on in their lives. Okay, there's a question from Erica, especially for Dawn and Joan. As an Israeli author and as an author whose new book features stories set in Israel, please tell us about your experiences navigating the publishing world and promotion, especially this year in mainstream spaces. Any advice or suggestions for others in similar situations? And Dawn, if any of your work involves Israel, then please chime in also.
Well, I'll jump in because it's current right now. And thank you, Erica, for that question. And I know that Erica and many of us have been following a lot of the stuff happening in the literary world for Jewish writers and people writing about Israel. And I won't repeat all that. I think most people know that it's a charged environment, to say the least. I actually, if anyone's interested, I just had a piece put up last week at the Jewish Book Council Paper Brigade Daily, and it's about bringing a book out right now, and it recounts some experience I just had in Israel, where people would say to me, I'd say to my Israeli friends, how are you doing? And they go, wait, how are you doing in America? It was related to that. And it helped, it informed to some extent the way I was going to approach promoting this book, which was coming out like last week. I just put the only observations I'll make is I was obviously, I don't have any great solutions. I was aware of all of this. I was sensitive to it. I early on told the publicist that we might have to pivot. At one point, the publicist looked at the places where I've lived in the past in America, mentioned a few cities where I knew there were weekly protests, some of which were violent. And I said, I don't think you should pitch me to these places, even if, I'm short stories. It's hard sometimes to get invitations anyway, but I said, they're not going to invite me, or if they do, no one will come, or if someone comes, it may not be pleasant. So I had to pivot away from that. But there's two other pieces that I found interesting. One is that the Jewish community really was interested. I mean, half the stories are set in Israel, and it turns out my first two books, I did a lot of talks in the Jewish community because they also were Jewish books. But this time it's even more so. You say, my husband was on the phone making some calls to Jewish venues while we were in Israel. Say, I'm calling from Tel Aviv. They'd say, oh, I'll speak to you. Jewish communities are interested. That's one thing. And I did get a very good piece of advice from an editor at a literary magazine who is not Jewish. And she was going to do something in their magazine. The bus story was originally in their magazine. And she said, I just want to offer a suggestion. I'm not Jewish. I live in New York. I have a lot of Jewish friends. She said, but I saw where you're speaking, and it's 99% Jewish venues. She said, I recognize the need to protect yourself, but you might be limiting yourself unnecessarily. And I have discovered in the course of preparing for this book, I've been invited to some podcasts, and the podcast hosts are people who love books and reading, and they haven't been Jewish, completely interested in the book, totally sensitive to what's going on, and have spoken to me before and after the podcast about what's happening. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, there's issues going on, but not to assume that the whole reading public is like the most vocal or egregious stuff we see in the public space. So, no solutions, but just to see it's a little, that's like everything. It's a little more nuanced than it might look at first blush. I don't know what you think, Dan.
Well, I think the thing that concerns me more is self-censorship. It's to say, okay, I'm not going to write about this now because nobody's going to want to publish it. Or, I finished a play this year, and it does relate to Israel, but it was before October 7th. It's taking place in the 2000s. And, I do have a sense that it's going to be a hard sell because Israel is so controversial, and there's only one way people are relating to it now. And my book came out a month after October 7th, so that wasn't actually very helpful because there was only one story. So it was, for several months in the mainstream Jewish media. But it's hard to tell because it's also a small publisher. You never know how, what's the limitations of the publisher's capacities and connections, and what's the limitations of something else. For me, publicists have said, look, they don't want books by white males. You're a white male, and it's going to be really hard to get anyone interested. I was like, okay, is it because it's Jewish? He said, no, it's because you're a male. There's so many uncontrollable factors that we can attribute, but it's just keep knocking on the door, and I think keep putting stuff out there. I also on a bunch of podcasts there was some more interest in the anti-Semitism of the book, which is only a small part of the story, but that's what was engaging everybody at the moment. So the next book I'm writing will be set in Israel, but it's way too early to know anything. So we'll see where the world is by the time that's ready to get out there, because it's going to change. It's going to keep moving.
Waiting for the news story, like the story to move on from Israel.
Well, once the war ends.
Yeah. Someone who I had on the program for one of the solidarity sessions that I had, Alyssa Wald, she wrote something the other week about something about our current moment in parentheses, which is seems like an eternity, which does. I don't.
So I had a question for you and Joan, and maybe Dawn also, which is, when you're writing, especially writing stories taking place in Israel, part of the issue for me is that my interaction with Israelis takes place in Hebrew, and my interaction with my family and other Americans takes place in English. So I'm always trying to find the linguistic solution to that. How do I, because things just sound different in Hebrew. And if I translate it, it's not the same thing as what would have, the conversation unfolds differently. So I'm just curious about that, or Dawn, if you're writing about characters who are also, speaking other languages, how do you deal with that?
So it's interesting. I have a poor Hebrew. I have some, but poor. So I have some ear for it, but I've noticed that occasionally, if it's not too over the top, I've long been interested in issues of dialect and the way things sound. So in one of the stories, that beautiful Stoll story, there's Israeli soldiers who approach these American girls that are wandering the Arab Shuk. And at one point, one of them says to him, "You know the phrase Yafei Nefesh? You know what means this?" And in other words, he was actually, however, in my head, speaking in English to her. And he was, so I could imitate that. But I have sometimes, well, actually, I just now realized I didn't really answer your question because I was using an Israeli who was speaking. I was writing an Israeli speaking in English, so I could use his syntax, is what I'm saying. But I guess I rely occasionally on syntax, or the rhythm, slightly different rhythm. I have no doubt you have obviously a great ear from what I heard you read. I'm sure that you would find the same types of ways of rendering the different languages. They all have their own, syntax and music. So I just think it's, I don't know, it can enhance a piece. I'm sorry, I'm not really being very articulate in answering your question, but just as someone who writes about people who speak in Hebrew, and sometimes I know they're speaking in Hebrew to each other, I don't ever like flag it. I mean, that's, you don't put, I once had a student who was like putting in parentheses the translation of a certain food, Indian food, and, spiced bread. No, you don't do that. You just have to create enough context in which it seems to sound right. I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe Edgar Carrot helps me a lot. His translations sound really good. And they capture both the flavor of the Hebrew as well as the English. So I don't know. I enjoy that aspect of it, actually.
That reminds me of something I wanted to say after you spoke, Joan, which is that I think I first met you, well, aside from when we met a long time ago, camp,
Yeah.
but when you were like dissecting an Edgar Carrot story at the Bar Ilan conference, I went to, and you did a brilliant analysis of it.
Great story, Bottle, right? Where the guy
I
puts
don't remember what the story was. I
his
remember
friend in a bottle in a bar. He said he can't get the guy out of the bottle.
Right. My stories also done are the few that do take place in Israel, I think are mostly among non-Hebrew speakers or a Hebrew speaker speaking to an English speaker. So they're speaking in English, but there's certain phrases that I'll keep in Hebrew in the story, and hopefully the reader can figure it out from the context. And on that note, let me just go back to answer Erica's. It's not a real answer to Erica's question, but I just, I've started submitting some of my stories for my new collection, and I have a few that are very Jewish, and one that's a couple that are quite Zionist and Israeli. And I just got, it's not an acceptance, but I got a really nice rejection from the New England Review, which is a good journal. And it's, I've been submitting to there for years, and it was very complimentary. So I was really psyched about that. And that was one with a lot of Israeli characters in the story. So that was heartening also. We're really, this could go on. We could keep talking, but I know I want to thank everybody for coming, and just say two more things. One is that our July event is going to be on July 14th. I'm finalizing the authors, and I hope I will see you all there. And the last thing I want to end with is just to recite the prayer for the captives. Can you all see my screen? Yes. Okay. All right. So this is not exactly the one that we say in my shul, and it's been a little bit adopted. Mishaber Avoteno ve'imoteno Abraham v'Sarah Yitzchak v'Rivka Yaakov Leah v'Rachel ve'et Lochamenu Yehoshua David v'Yehuda Dvorah Yael v'Yehudit הוא יברך את שבויי ונעדרי צה"ל והאזרחים והאזרחיות החטופים והחטופות הנתונים והנתונות בשבעה צרה. יהי רצון מפניך אדוני צבאות שתפדה נפשם משבי ותחזירם במהרה לארצם ולביתם בריאים ושלמים בגופם ובנפשם, ותיתן תבונה בלב העמלים לשחרורם, ותיתן רחמים בלב שוביהם. ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כל ברמה נשמע נהי תמורים, רחל מבכה על בניה, מענה להנחם על בניה כי איננו. כה אמר אדוני מנעי קולך, מבכי בעינייך נדמעה, כי יש שכר לפעולתך, נאום אדוני, ושבו מארץ אויב, ויש תקווה לאחריתך, נאום אדוני, ושבו בנים ובנות לגבולם. ונאמר amen. And that's from the book of Jeremiah, the original. So I want to say thank you to our writers tonight and to everyone who is here. Halavai that by tomorrow or by the next event we have, I won't have to keep saying this. Shaverach. Thank you again, Dawn, Joan, and everybody here. And let's remember the good things also. So l'chaim to our 50th event and to the visceral tovot that we had yesterday. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.